I'm exhausted. Maybe that's not the right word. I'm weary. My body, my mind, my soul, I feel empty. I know we're all doing the best we can, but if you ask me, everyone's weary. Our bodies might not feel it, but our souls do. On Friday, Henry and I went to get our hair cut. It was the first time since March. Now, we were chatting it up with the lady who cuts our hair, and we start talking about the coronavirus and how this has affected her. What she said to me, I can't stop thinking about. She said, I went into Target last week for the first time since March. It's not the constant worry that gets me, although I do worry all the time about people standing too close, people not wearing masks. It's not even the dystopian reality that the Target shelves are bare and the loudspeaker is telling me to hurry up and to get what I came in for so I can get out and don't try anything on. Those things are terribly sad and off-putting too. But the thing that really gets me and depresses me is there's no joy in the building. You can feel the void of life. It's like it's been sucked out of the room. No one speaks. No one has energy. It's just a bunch of weary souls. Man, that last phrase got me. Weary souls. We're all feeling this. Everything's hard. Everything's taxing, confusing, confounding. We are bone tired and soul weary. And this is our collective liminal space. As you know now, liminality is the in-between space. The threshold crossing where we are transitioning into something, but we're not quite there yet. This is what our sermon series has been about since the beginning of June and what our lives have been about since the beginning of March. And today, we see it with the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. It's the story of Jesus walking on water, but it's also more than that. The disciples are exhausted and they are caught in liminal space, both literally and spiritually. They're literally in a boat, in between one shoreline and another. And water is all around them. There's a storm and the waves are crashing the boat. It's early in the morning, which means they've had to endure this storm all night. I mean, their physical liminal space is everywhere. And this is true for them spiritually too. They are bone tired and soul weary. Their friend and colleague, John the Baptist, has just been killed. Not enough attention has been placed on that for them. They tried to retreat yesterday and to grieve his death, but people came out of the woodwork so they wanted to meet Jesus, hear Jesus, and also have him heal them. We saw this in last week's sermon when Jesus complied to the crowd's needs and the disciples spent all the little energy they had left helping organize thousands of people all day long. They tried to disperse the crowd at dinner, but Jesus did something incredible. He broke a small amount of bread and fish and fed everyone. Instead of grieving John the Baptist's death, retreating and resting for their own sake, they ended up feeding 5,000 people. So now they're really exhausted, bone tired, soul weary. And Jesus is too. At this moment, he retreats to the mountains to pray. Verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. This is a healthy reminder for all of us that when our souls are weak and weary, we need to retreat. Henry Nouwen calls this raising your drawbridge. You can't pour out if you have nothing left in the tank. You have to, at times, raise the drawbridge, cut yourself off. This kind of self-care, it is holy and needed. Perhaps the reasons we're feeling bone-tired and soul-weary is because we're running on empty, and we need solace in solitude in order to recharge, refocus, and regroup. Perhaps the most spiritual lesson in our text today is that we must build in moments for self-care. Otherwise, we'll remain bone-tired and soul-weary. So back to the story. Verse 24. By this time, the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, and for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, he came walking toward them on the sea. This is the second thing we must see. Jesus comes to them in their exhaustion. He goes towards their liminal space. He enters into their storm and calms it. He participates in it. This is a huge lesson Christians need to understand. You don't have to live flawlessly and joyously, pretending to be perfect or pleasant all the time in order to experience the presence of God. Not at all, actually. Jesus doesn't wait until you have it all figured out. Jesus comes as the ultimate comforter, the shepherd, and He comes in the midst of our pain, in our chaos. So if you're bone tired and soul weary, then look up, because Christ is standing in front of you. Verse 26. But when the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Now, of course they think He's a ghost. They have no idea He can walk on water. But for us reading this text, we need to understand that Jesus is the God of the universe made flesh. And time and boundaries and distances can't stop the maker of the universe, the curator of our souls, from getting to us in times of need. No matter how far you've strayed or how broken you feel or how tired you are, Christ comes to you and says, "Do not be afraid." Which means He doesn't come with hostility. He doesn't come judging us for our sins or mistakes or even our weariness. We're not being judged. We're being loved. We're met with compassion and comfort. We're told, "Do not be afraid." This matters for us who are trapped in liminal spaces. Christ is ahead of us in our future, stepping back towards us, telling us we can move forward in faith, which will be towards Him. And we can do this without being afraid. And speaking of stepping forward, look what happens to Peter next. Verse 28. Peter answered Him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out His hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why do you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped Him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now we need to make this connection today. Jesus is ahead of us and calls us out onto the waves, meaning we have to leave the liminal space of the boat, the safety net that we've crafted for ourselves. We have to leave it behind, stepping into the unknown. Now, I know this is scary, but think of what it means spiritually. We can leave behind the in-between, the space that is really no place. And we do it by taking the hand of Christ and having faith that we are met with love. Maybe you need to hear this today. No matter how terrible you feel or how bad COVID-19 has been for you and your family, Christ's promise is that we can step forward out of it because He meets us in it and pulls us into a better tomorrow. This is true for Peter, except when he gets distracted. Look at verse 30. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." This happens to us too. We get distracted. Liminality pulls us back, and we lose sight of where Christ is. Some of us get too scared and long to be back in the boat. But if we keep going, what happens to Peter in verse 31 will happen to us. Jesus immediately reached out His hand and caught him. So what is our liminal lesson for today? We need to own our discomfort and pain. We need to do a body and soul check and see how weary we've become. And we need to build in self-care, because when we do, Christ comes to us out of love, calls us forward away from the in-between spaces. And when we get distracted and we start to fall away, He reaches out His hand and pulls us up. I don't know about you, but I need to hear this today. My bone-tired and soul-weary self needs to be reminded that Christ is in this with us, calling me forward, pulling me up, telling me not to be afraid. And He's doing the same for you. And that presence isn't a ghost. It's God loving us, joining us, calling us forward. All we have to do is step out of the boat.